Hello everyone, welcome to today's session. In this session, we will work on our next coding part. So move forward and let's start our session. Now another thing you probably also noticed is that even though we are using variables here so that we don't have to change those values in 4 different places, a lot of these 4 lines are actually pretty similar. The only difference in those 4 lines are actually these number right here. Everything else is exactly the same. So what if instead we wanted to make this code cleaner and basically avoid this type of duplication in our code, right? So for example, if we did this for 10 different values, we would have the same line, this long line, basically 10 times, right? So how do we avoid this type of duplication? So right here, we actually avoided duplication for specific values, right piece of string here, a whole calculation here, but how do we actually avoid duplicating a whole line? Write the whole piece of code, generally which has multiple different stuff in it, not just a value, and we do that using functions. So functions are generally blocking of code like this, right? Or basically logic in code that does something. It's not just simply a value, but actually does something more complex that is again used in order to avoid repeating the same logic or most of the same logic in your code. So how do we create functions? Just like we created variables here, we create functions, and the way we do that is using following syntax. Right here, let's create our first function. We start with def. So we define a function just like we define a variable. But for function, we need this keyword generally called def. And now we can give our function a name just like we gave name to our variable. We can give our function a name, and here we can use the same standard like for variable. We can name the function something descriptive, something that actually says what this function does, and let's call our function days to units, and then we have the brackets and a colon. So this line generally defines a function. It tells Python, hey, whatever comes after this is actually going to be a block of code that is going to be referred to or is going to be named days to units. And how do you write a function? I'm just going to copy this one actually here, and let's give us some space. And again, this is very specific to Python. We need to indent here with spaces, and I'm going to paste in what I copied inside these 2 lines. Generally tell Python this piece of code or this line of code, because we just have one line here, belongs to a function called days to units, and again we just have one line, but this could be a function with 100 of lines. So I can write whatever I want. The next line is all good, and then I can do some calculations and I can write whatever logic I want here, and all this will belong to this function. So now this logic is inside a function that is called days to units, and we can actually get rid of this and test our function. And here, if you noticed, we have this yellow line under the function name. That's actually a warning for our code style. It says we need 2 blank lines before. So PyCharm has a built-in official style guide for Python that tells you how to style your code or how to write your code correctly. Now, why is code style important? Just like you write code, you need to read code from other developers or your own code to understand what the code is actually doing. So it's important that code is easily readable, and this is just another example of how an editor like PyCharm helps you to write code. So, to fix the warning, we are just going to add a new blank line before the function definition. So, now what happens? If I execute this block of code, I have the variables defined here that I am using in the function, and then we have these two print statements. So, what happens if I execute now, and as you see in the output here, there is no output. Nothing actually got printed. So what actually happened? Because we have those two print statements that we define in the function, but we don't see anything in the output. And the way it works is whenever you create a function or define a function like this, you actually have to use that function. Again, this is a similar concept to variables. We have created variables here, and we are using that variable in our code. The same way we created a function and we need to use that function. How do we use a function? Or in programming language, it's called calling a function or executing a function. And we do that using the name of the function like this, and as you see in the suggestion as well, using brackets like this. So this syntax here basically is what we call calling the function that we define right here or using that function. So now if we execute it, there you go. You see that those two lines got executed and we have the result here. So we are creating variables and we are using that here. We are creating a function and we are using that function here. And note the difference between using a variable and using a function. Python knows this is a function because we are providing these brackets at the end, right? That tells us we are making a function call. But as you see now, we have these 50 days, so this only works for 50 days, right? What about other values that we had about 30 days and 100 days? We haven't deduplicated that. We just have one case here. So how do we use functions? So that everything else except for these two values right here actually stay the same, and we do that in programming by giving our functions same kind of input value, which are also called parameters. So instead of having this 50 basically here hard coded as we said here, and here we provide that value of 5 or 30 or whatever that value is. Generally whenever we use the function, so we are telling Python use these days to units function with the value of 50 or use that function with the value of 30. And we define this input parameter in functions is very simply by defining this parameter between those brackets. So this is where the input, we as programmers define the input parameters. So right here, how do we define that? Using our already familiar variable. So basically right here, I am going to define a variable and I'm going to call it whatever I want. I'm going to call it days or numbers of days, but I'm not assigning a value to that variable, right, like I did here, because I want it to be assigned whenever I use the function. So this generally tells Python that a function these two units can be used using one input parameter, which is called num of days, right? Number of days. So now the last part which is remaining is replacing these values using this variable, and just like we do it in these two places where we are also using variables defined here, exactly the same way we are gonna remove this and define a block for non-textual value, and we are gonna put our variable num updates here and also here. So you see now what our function actually doesn't have any fixed numbers in it. Instead, we are using variables. We are using two variables that are defined outside that function, and we are using one variable that is defined within that function, right? This variable actually belongs to that function. And now, as you see, whenever we want to use that function, we are telling Python, hey, call this function, call days to units with a parameter and input generally of 30. So now if we execute it, by the way, we can also do it here. You see 30 days here are, and the calculation was done here, and hours. And now if we go back to our previous example where we wanted to calculate these for four different values, right, for different number of days, we can actually do the same. So we had 50, then we had 40, and we had 100, right? So this generally gives us exactly the same logic that we had previously, but with different syntax. So you see the difference, that instead of having this 4 times, we have much cleaner syntax where we actually see what this logic is doing, which are days to units, and then we have the number of days that we pass or give our function as parameter. And if I execute this, you see that it was printed 4 times for all different values. We can actually remove this line. And now if we make some change in our function, for example, we change the name of this variable. We want it to be hours instead of units. We just do it once in one place, and that's basically it. So whatever change we make inside that function, and that is actually the big advantage of using functions in code. Whatever change we make inside here, it doesn't affect how we use the function, because for using the function we only need the name of that function and the input parameter. Now probably you're wondering, what happens if I do not give my function a value? So let's delete those lines, and let's say we do not provide any value here, and we try to execute or call our function without the parameter, and let's execute, and you see that Python interpreter is complaining because we have told Python here is a function called these two units, and whenever I want to use that, or my colleagues another programmer wants to use that function, they have to provide an input value here, right? So now whenever Python sees the uses of that function and there is no input parameter that we are giving that function, it cannot execute that function, because basically this value is missing here, right? And that's why we get an error which also says missing one required argument. So as you see, whenever we define a function with a parameter with input parameter, we have to also provide that input parameter. Another thing that you may be also wondering is, what if I want to provide multiple input parameters to functions? How do I do that? It's actually very simple. You can do that by simply defining here another input parameter separated by comma, and let's say we want to pass here something that we want to print out additionally, like an editable message doesn't really matter, and in exactly the same way as the first one, we can actually use it in here. We can even create a new line and just print out that message. And note that if you are using a variable without stream, so it's just a variable itself. We are not using any text. In that case, you don't need this format. So you can generally just print it out directly. And now again, we have told Python, I have this function and two input parameters are required. So I also need to pass two input values whenever I use that function. So now let me just pass in some editable message. Let's say I'm happy about the calculation, or I know I'm going to be happy. So let's say amazing, and let's do another calculation. And this time I say looks nice. And if I execute it, you see that I get amazing the first time, and then for 30 I get looks nice. So you can define and provide as many input parameters as you want. Common practice, and also what you will see in just normal code, in just a handful of input parameters, maybe one or two. So it's not actually overloaded with 10 parameters. Now that we know functions and variables, why they are used or why they are useful and how we use them, there is one point that I want to mention, which is variable scopes in functions. What does it mean? As I mentioned previously, in this function, we are using multiple variables, right? We are using two variables that are part of the input that we provide, then using a function, and we are using two variables that are defined outside the function somewhere else in the code. So variable scope basically means where is the variable that function uses defined, and variable has a global scope for a function. If it is defined outside the function, like these two variables right here, could be completely in a different file, not even in the same file where the function is. So these are global variables. So all the functions that you have in your Python code can use those global variables, and then you have local variables. Local variables are variables that are created within that function. So these two variables are generally only available inside that function because it was created within that function. So internal scope and global scope, so that means that when we create another function, let's call it scope check, because that's what we are going to do. We want to test the scope. In this function, I can access the global variable like name of units, but I cannot access the internal variable like number of days. And let's actually test that. So I have num of unit, which is a global variable defined here outside the function, and the second one, I have a variable that is defined inside another function. So as I said, internal, and as you see right here, we already get a red line underneath that says unresolved reference num of days. So for this function, that variable is not visible, it's not accessible, it doesn't exist basically at all, and we can even test it actually. So again, if we want to see the result, we have to actually use that function like this. Run the function, and if I execute it, you see that we get an error that says name num of days is not defined, right? It doesn't know that there is a function like that anywhere in code. However, it does recognize the global variable, and that means that variable defined outside function itself. Global variables are accessible to all the functions, and if you have variables defined inside the function, then they are only accessible for that specific function and not for other ones. And that means actually that if num of days variable does not exist for scope check variable, we can actually create a variable inside scope check with the same name, and we would have no problem at all. So this is not going to be a duplicate because this function doesn't know about this variable, the number of days here, and scope check doesn't know anything about variable num of days right here. And if we want to use that function, now we have to provide the value. Let's do 50, and if I execute, there you go. You have name of units and the 50 that we provided. So global variable, local variable defined here. Another interesting thing is that, as I said, inside the function body, so to say, so this is whatever is part of the function, right? In this indentation is called function body. So we can create whatever logic we want inside that function body. So whatever I can do in Python, generally I can do it inside the function body. So one of those things is actually creating variables, right? Just like we created variables here, we can create variables here like this. Let's call it my variable and variable inside function, and we can print that out as well. So now we have three types of variables that we are using in this function. We have a global variable, we have internal variable that is passed in as a parameter, and we have internal variable again that is generally defined. So the variable isn't provided when we use the function, but it's basically just defined inside the variable. And again, if I execute this, see, hours num updates and variable inside function text printed out like this. And obviously, this is just for demonstration, but we are going to see more realistic examples of that in our projects. So this is all about today's session. In the next session, we will work on the next coding concept. If you guys have any doubt or any question, you can ask me in the comment section. Thank you so much for watching our video.